no introduction, and this is one of those people who need no introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Lance Geiger, the history guy.
Yeah, I'm the history guy, and I hope most of you know who I am. I'm always, it's such an honor to be on this stage because I'm mostly just a guy who makes videos in his basement in Illinois. But it's amazing the sorts of things that I get invited to do. And this is a great lineup this year, and so I'm proud to be a part of it. The talks are, they can be tend to be pretty technical, and there's certainly people who know more about how tanks operate than I do, but I'm kind of a storyteller by heart. And the story of the tank is really a story of war, because these are machines that are made by war. But I thought today that I would come out and talk about the bit of the story of tanks that has nothing to do with war, and that is those times during peacetime when people just decided to drive off with the tank because they thought it would be fun. And I just want to make sure that I say from the start, this is not a suggestion to anyone. Please don't do that, or they'll never invite me back. In May of 1995, U.S. military veteran Sean Timothy Nelson was struggling. His wife had divorced him in 1990, and she told a local newspaper that he was spiraling out of control with methamphetamines and alcohol. He'd become disabled from a back injury. He was unable to work. He had lost his business. His home was in the process of foreclosure. He had become increasingly erratic in his behavior. He was at the time digging a hole in his backyard in California, hoping to strike gold. Desperate, depressed, addicted, and apparently suicidal, he decided to do something that was dangerous and irrational, but something that I think that many people who come to Tankfest might in some small way understand. Now, you might have noticed, if you watch my channel, any History Guy fans in this group? Yeah, one or two. You might have noticed if you watch my channel that I am fond of tanks, or if you saw my top 5 tanks video, or my bottom 5 tanks video here at the museum, that I'm very fond of this museum. I think it has an extraordinary collection. I think it preserves it and maintains it and displays it with extraordinary skill, and you see that with Tankfest, which I think is just an extraordinary event. It is a museum in the finest tradition. But I think it's great that Tankfest has sold out again this year, and I find the enthusiasm for Tankfest to be very meaningful, because this is a nation that has an astounding amount of cultural fare. If you spend any time in the United Kingdom, you know. This is the nation of Shakespeare. It's the nation of Austen and Newton and Faraday. This is a nation with great institutions like the British Museum and the National Gallery and the Royal Opera House. And I think that some might think of something like the Tank Museum as being somewhat lowbrow by comparison. And I think they're wrong if they think that. So I've had the opportunity to visit many places in the United Kingdom, in the towns and cities and villages of this island, and in the alcoves of its churches. I have seen very few memorials to opera singers or ballerinas. But in nearly every town where there's at least one memorial... do I have the clicker? Who's moving my slides? Just... It's right here. Oh, there we go. I walked off without that. And tell me if I'm in the wrong place. But in every town, in every village, in every church that you see in the United Kingdom, there's at least one memorial to people who have died in war. And that's part of the nature of what goes on in the United Kingdom. It's part of what the United Kingdom commemorates. This one, I think, if you can see it, is in Cheltenham. Are you looking at a war memorial right now? That's a picture of me. Did it move? Okay, we'll work on that. Take my word for it. Oh, yeah, there we go. That's in Cheltenham. And it's particularly interesting to me because that's a memorial to young men who died in the area in the Crimean War, but it became sort of a de facto monument to 2 wars, because originally this memorial had... Oh, is it working? They said it's working. Originally this memorial had 2... back up out of the window. This memorial had 2 cannons on top of it that were captured at Sevastopol. And those 2 cannons were given to the government during the Great War for the metal to be used in the war. So it became de facto sort of a memorial to both wars. The history of this kingdom is one in which its people have repeatedly been asked to make enormous sacrifices in war. It's not an insult, thank you, or I mean no insult, to the Royal Ballet to say that the sacrifices represented in the thousands of war memorials, the many regimental museums, which I think are truly unsung gems among the British museums, and if you have a chance to visit one of those, I really suggest that you do. The Imperial War Museum, of course, and the Tank Museum stand as peers to the Tate or the Royal Opera. Because after all, Trafalgar Square was not named after Shakespeare. And perhaps to illustrate the point, it was one of the most celebrated authors of the English language, Rudyard Kipling, who first suggested this museum in 1923. Kipling was a man who felt deeply and personally the loss of war because his son John died in the Great War. And he understood the importance of remembering the sacrifice of war because he was a member of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And he was the author of what is often considered to be one of the best examples of a regimental history with his history of the Irish Guards. But still, with all of those memorials, Tankfest is a little bit different. It's interesting because unlike war memorials, this event is more celebratory than somber for the most part. And it comes from a deep-seated interest in the science and the engineering and yes, the art of some of the most extreme examples of human ingenuity. This is about the love, by it appears, a great many people who are willing even to brave the weather of the tank. And I share that love. And I recall quite vividly my first visit to this museum in 2015. Do you see me there? Did it move? No? There we go. Okay. Can you be more geek than me wearing my Star Trek shirt pointing at Tiger 131? That's how I showed up. That was before I was the history guy, by the way. And as an exceptional stroke of luck, my friends and I got here a little bit early, and so we were kind of wandering the grounds. And we happened to meet Mike Hayton, who was for decades the man who was responsible for keeping these vehicles in working order. And he was kind enough to lead three fanboys on an unofficial behind-the-scenes tour of the preparation for Tankfest. He's one of the kindest people you'll ever meet, by the way, and 7 years later, when I was back, he was kind enough to pretend like he remembered meeting us that other time. And we got to see him again as he was directing the tank part at Tankfest 2 years ago. And this museum and tank lovers everywhere really have much to thank Mike for, but he really demonstrated the love of the tank. And I recall when Roz Skellern, who used to be with PR here at the museum, sent me a note in 2019 asking if YouTube's The History Guy would like to come make a top 5 tanks video for the Tank Museum. And I swear that email started with the words, "I don't know." This doesn't usually happen in my basement. It started with the words, "I don't know if you know who we are." Yeah, Roz, I'd heard of the Tank Museum. And she asked if I wanted to come make a video. I said I would swim the Atlantic if I had to. Luckily, that wasn't necessary. And filming the Top 5 Tanks episode was a whole lot of fun, and again, a testament to the professionalism of the people at this institution. But when I filmed that episode back in 2019, the team asked if there was anything else that I thought we needed to finish the video. And I told them I thought we needed a few shots of me in a running tank. Did it go?
Wrong way.
Oh, wrong way?
And again.
We got? Anyway, that's me. I think it's a leopard. Maybe it's a leopard too. I don't know. The museum, occasionally you'll see promos in this. They did some promos for Tankfest this year of me standing in this tank. So I just said I need to be in a tank. They gave me a pair of overalls. But one of the things that was really funny about this, putting me in the tank, I'll know how to push the right button now, is that they had a driver inside and they kept him in there because I couldn't be alone in the running tank because they just thought I might get ideas and run off with it. And I'm guessing that it would cross the mind of more than a few people in this audience, right? And I said in that promo, I said, I collect Army hats because I can't afford to collect Army tanks, if you've seen that promo too. And by coincidence, just a couple of weeks ago, I got to meet a fascinating gentleman. You see a picture there? He lives in the Cotswolds, and he does own Army tanks. And he restores them, and there are more people who engage in that hobby than you might think. And he had just purchased an M4A1 for the low price of just £100,000. And he offered some very good advice to anybody who's interested in this hobby. He says, never show up to a show, a military show, drunk, because you might come home with a £100,000 tank and then have to explain that to your wife. So the idea is don't mix tanks and alcohol, which brings us to this. Is that a great headline? Don't get drunk around tanks is generally good advice. In this case, in a stunning case of drunk driving, the subject of the story, reported in The Guardian in 2009, is an 18-year-old British soldier who had a blood alcohol level of more than twice the legal limit in Germany when he stole the Scimitar light tank from the headquarters of the United Kingdom's 7th Armor Brigade in Germany. He was so drunk he only managed to make it about 500 meters before he crashed it. But undeterred, the story says, disappointed but undeterred, he got out of it, went back to the base, and stole a second tank. And then in running away from the military police, he drove that one into a tree. So that's now we have two good examples of why not to get drunk around tanks. You might think that's plenty, but there are more. Is that another headline or is that me? Okay. Wish I could see the thing. In 2018, a Russian man stole an armored personnel carrier from a military driving school in Murmansk, which is way up above the Arctic Circle. And after driving over a car, because if you steal a tank, I think driving over a car is pretty much a necessity, the man, who was apparently drunk, drove through the front of a supermarket, jumped out, climbed across the rubble, and tried to steal a bottle of wine, which takes that idea of a smash and grab robbery to a new level. The Guardian headline said that he was, quote, rolling in the aisles. In 2019, a man in Poland was responsible for loading a 50-year-old T-55 tank belonging to the Polish military onto a lorry. And anybody who's tried to drive a tank up the ramp onto a lorry, you know that that can be difficult to do. And so he managed to break the ramp, and being apparently drunk and now no longer able to load the tank, he decided instead that he would just go drive the tank around town. Now this was a T-55 in Poland, and so villagers were alarmed that they had been invaded by the Russians. He was arrested for drunk driving and driving without insurance. I want to make a little interlude here. There's a lot to the history of the tank, but if you don't know this, the first tanks that were actually produced were produced by the Land Ship Committee, and they were actually under the patronage of the Royal Navy, because the first Lord of the Royal Navy, a guy named Winston Churchill, was a real supporter of the tank, and they were originally given the title, this one I think served in the Middle East, but they were given the title HMLS. Do you know what that stands for? Her Majesty, His Majesty's, I'm sorry, His Majesty's Land Ships. And thus, and this is important if you're a History Guy fan, that suggests then that if you steal a tank, that could be called piracy. Because don't all good stories involve pirates? Now, alcohol is not the only way you can be inebriated, and so this is a good one. Is that me or is that a picture of a... Okay. In 1969, 19-year-old U.S. Army Private John Dugan was assigned to the headquarters company for the 1st Airborne Brigade of the 8th Infantry Division, which at the time was stationed at the U.S. Army's Lee Barracks, which was near Mainz, Germany. The U.S. Army in 1969 was struggling with a number of issues, and one of those was drug abuse, and Private Dugan was, as one fellow soldier put it, absolutely dripping with LSD when he started what has been called the Battle of the Bash. Now, the M587, as military vehicles go, is not one that you would think you would start a battle with. It's a light recovery vehicle, and it was a 54,000-pound armored vehicle used on the same chassis as the M107 self-propelled gun, but it's not a vehicle built for attack. It doesn't have a main gun. You can see, while lightly armored, it's really a vehicle for picking up other tanks. The New York Daily News reported on July 4th of 1969, an Army spokesman said the 8th Infantry Division soldier drove the giant vehicle used to pick up disabled tanks through its garage doors and a gate, and then went on a rampage through Mainz and 3 suburban towns. The soldier, who was of course tripping on acid, destroyed numerous parked cars, part of an orchard, and several roads, as well as the vehicle, and what the Army assessed to be some $50,000 US in damages before he simply parked the vehicle. He was arrested, but still tripping on LSD, he managed to escape, but he finally turned himself in after, quote, the LSD apparently wore off. So when Tom in the marketing department asked me what I wanted to speak about this year when I came to the Tank Museum, I have to say I put this topic up because I thought it would be fun, but I was a little bit concerned that someone at the Tank Museum might think that this was a bad idea to come in front of a group of tank enthusiasts away from a park full of running tanks, next to a large car park full of cars and talk about people stealing tanks and running over cars with them. But luckily, no one thought any the better of that. But I want to reiterate, as I have throughout, this is not a suggestion. Please don't do this. Everybody that we find doing this was either drunk, insane, or had a very bad cause. It's a bad idea. Just like this, as you see. Are you seeing the Monkey World sign there? Is that me again? Okay. No? There we go. Everybody comes here, sees the sign, and everybody asks, what could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong with me talking about this here? Well, don't do it because they'll never invite me back. So to be extremely clear, this is not a suggestion. The people I'm going to talk about made exceedingly bad choices, and no one here should ever emulate those choices. And yet I think, again, that many of us deep down could at least sympathize with them. I've never tripped on LSD, but if I did and there was a tank nearby, I don't know that I can stand for my decisions. This idea has been immortalized in popular culture, for example, via the 1984 action comedy Tank, the notable chase scene in the 1995 James Bond film GoldenEye. And so it should come as no surprise that some few people have in time given into their enthusiasm for armored vehicles, maybe more than you would expect. Is that a headline? What's it say? Huh? Yes. So am I looking at a headline for the guy, and he says gleefully. You see the word gleefully? Yeah. Well, in 2011, this young man who was just 22 was in North Yorkshire when he took a warrior tank without consent, which is a line that makes me laugh because I think you could assume the without consent part is being kind of a given. But then he proceeded to, quote, gleefully drive it over a Vauxhall car that a soldier had parked there. In his defense, his solicitor argued that he had been egged on by his friends and that the military had left the hangar with the vehicles open. So in the story, his mother is quoted as blaming the military because, of course, if you leave your garage door open, it's okay to steal the car, and if you leave the garage door open with the tanks, it's okay to steal the tanks. But the tongue-in-cheek, the story concludes the car now appears to be a convertible. Perhaps the craziest bit of this whole thing, the man's attorney argued that it was common for soldiers to allow friends to drive tanks around the base, although the Ministry of Defense denied this claim. I found it particularly humorous, by the way, that the newspaper, the UK, the Standard UK, posted the story under the Homes and Property page. So apparently this is mostly a morality story about why you should close your garage door. Again, not a suggestion. But I still think many of us can understand the part where he was gleeful when he drove over the car, right? I mean, at least that much. Ease of theft was a common theme, so in 1993, this story, a man upset at a police in Perth, Australia, stole an Australian Army M113 armored personnel carrier from a barracks and proceeded to drive it through the wall of a police station, run over several police private vehicles, and circled the Perth Parliament House before finally being disabled after police dropped tear gas inside the vehicle. Comically, witnesses noted that the driver was using his turn signals and stopping at the stoplights. And about the ease of the theft, Brigadier Terry Nolan at the time was quoted, "If you'd asked me yesterday," excuse me for not doing an Australian accent here, "if you'd asked me yesterday, I would have said it's not easy to do it, but the evidence this morning would indicate that it's perhaps easier than I would have thought," which seems to be an understatement. That was actually part of the theme, the ease of stealing the tank was part of the theme of Timothy Nelson as well. Increasingly desperate and erratic, a neighbor described him as shirtless and looking disheveled when he simply drove his battered white van onto a National Guard armory where National Guard employees, were working late maintaining M60 tanks, which he had driven years previously in his brief military service. And apparently in the midst of the work, he was able to simply drive through the gate unnoticed, entered several tanks until he found one that he could start. At that point, he was noticed by the guardsmen who were working there, but, what could they do? They could do little to stop him from driving through the gates. The San Diego police chief was later quoted giving a piece of good advice. He says, "Don't leave the batteries and the keys in the tanks," which is going to be the big lesson of today. Make your tanks harder to steal. Now, if you want to experience the thrill of tank driving, of course, you can choose to serve your country. That's one way to do it. Or if you were like me, too old and fat to do that, you can pay someone like the good people at Drive a Tank in Casota, Minnesota. Is that what we're looking at? Am I still behind? I really need, oh, there we go. Drive a tank, Kasota, Minnesota. You know what you can do at a place called Drive a Tank? They'll let you drive a tank. And by the way, I was paid for this plug in tank. They let me drive tanks in exchange for telling you this. I am told, by the way, that there are places you can do this also in the UK. So that's probably a better solution than we've seen, but not that every situation should require consent. For example, in March of 2022, the independent New Delhi television reported a group of Ukrainian civilians posted a 22-second video of them joyriding around a frozen field in a Russian T-80B tank. The tank had been abandoned during a retreat, and the civilians were apparently celebrating the victory. And I think given the circumstances, they might rightly be forgiven for not seeking consent, but luckily for them, they get a tax break. Is that what we're seeing here? Yeah. So if you steal a tank in Ukraine right now, essentially what the government said is we don't want people to be shy about stealing Russian equipment for fear that they're going to be taxed on it. So there you go. That's the place to do it. In 2006 in Budapest, on the 50th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, there was a protest against the government, the first since the fall of the communist state, and in preparation for an annual celebration of the uprising, a vintage T-34 tank was placed out. It was supposed to have been disabled. They took the battery out, but what they didn't count on was there was a 70-year-old veteran there who had trained on the T-34 tank, and he knew that there was a secret way to start the tank even without a battery. And so he hot-wired the tank, which he then drove towards the riot police, who probably thought that they were well armed with their rubber bullets until they saw that coming. But he became afraid that he was going to harm someone in the rowdy crowd, and so he stopped it before he did much damage. But while his motive and the motives of the Ukrainians might have been obvious, Timothy Nelson's were never quite clear. Like the man ruining the police station in Perth, sometimes the motive, however, is political. In 2023, a group of veterans of Israel's Yom Kippur War stole a tank used in that war from a memorial with the apparent intent of using the tank as part of a protest against a judicial reform, although the vehicle was found and recovered before it could do much damage. Can we see the headline there? There's also just pictures of me shoved in here, so let me know if it's just that's what you're like. Another protest occurred, though, in the state of Colorado in 1987. The M109 155mm turreted self-propelled howitzer has been in service in the United States since 1963. And although it's gone through many versions, it's still in service today, the M109 is. And on November 11th, 1987, which happens to be Veterans Day in the United States, one such vehicle belonging to the 5th Battalion of the 29th Field Artillery, then stationed at Fort Carson, which is south of Colorado Springs, was taken on what newspapers at the time described as a 75-mile joyride. Officials told newspapers that the 27-ton self-propelled howitzer, which was nicknamed Clyde and valued at over $758,000 US, was stolen from the motor pool by a private who was stationed at Fort Carson and apparently had permission to be in that part of the facility, and a former soldier who carried a medically retired identification card. And the motive of the theft was never clearly stated, but the vehicle eventually ran out of gas less than 10 blocks from the Veterans Administration Hospital, and the theft was apparently related to frustration with the care being offered to veterans. And obviously, when those things happen, it causes a significant challenge to law enforcement. Colorado State Trooper Ray Elder told the United Press International, "In 22 years on the force, I've never had anything happen like this." I would hope not. Dispatch called me at home and said a tank was coming up the road, and I called them back 5 minutes later and I said, "A tank?" And one officer told the newspaper, "It's obviously we didn't have the capability to stop him, so officers of the Colorado State Patrol more or less escorted it to Denver to assure safe travel." At times the chase went up to nearly 45 miles per hour. It did only minor damage, actually, but the police did the only thing that they could do. When it ran out of gas, they ticketed it for illegal parking. Oddly, that was not the first time that had happened in an M109 self-propelled howitzer, because in 1980, an Army veteran who was apparently suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder scaled a fence into a maintenance shop and stole an M109 from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where coincidentally my dad served with the artillery, although I think that's unrelated. And the man proceeded to drive the howitzer through the gate and joyride it through a frantic zigzag course across the county. I love the subtitle. Are we looking at the headline right there? I love the subtitle, "Possibly the most extraordinary vehicle theft in Comanche County's history." Possibly. What else had happened in Comanche County, Oklahoma that would lead you to question that? And as the Colorado officers couldn't do much, one officer tried to pull in front of the vehicle to try to stop it, but he thought better of that. Another had his car damaged because it was towing a fence he drove through, and the fence damaged the car. But really, they said all we could do was sit and wait until he ran out of gas. It actually eventually bogged down in a field. He had been getting treatment at a Veterans Administration hospital and was apparently delusional at the time that it happened. And mental illness is another common theme. In 2007, a 45-year-old man in Sydney, Australia, went on a rampage that did some $6 million in damage, $6 million Australian dollars in damage. He worked for a trunking company that owned a Trojan armored personnel carrier that was, and I quote the local news, usually hired out for weddings and monster truck shows. And I know what you're thinking, what an awesome wedding. But he worked for that trucking company, he knew they had the tank, and a colleague said that when we had been in the Army doing telecommunications work, he had become convinced that mobile phone waves had hampered his mental state. And so he stole an armored personnel carrier, and he knocked out several mobile phone boxes. He went and knocked over the mobile phone towers, take that, cell phones. Although he was also charged with possession of a controlled substance, so there might have been something more to it there. Somewhat comically, he was also charged with driving in a dangerous manner. On June 4, 2018, during routine training at the Virginia National Guard Maneuver Training Center at Fort Pickett, a 29-year-old U.S. Army National Guard First Lieutenant took an M113 armored personnel carrier off base, led police on a 60-mile, 2-hour chase towards Richmond, Virginia. Originally, it was reported that he had been on drugs, but actually it turned out, which one am I on? I don't even know where I am here. Where they knocked out cell towers, I don't know. Originally, they said he'd been on drugs. It turned out, actually, that he has schizophrenia and was delusional. He was convinced that he had been told by secret agents that he was supposed to steal the tank in order to test the police response. And to prove that he was insane, he had also filed to run for the United States Senate, where I think he might get elected today, to be honest with you. And that all takes us back to Sean Nelson, where I started in 1995. In his rampages that went through San Diego is probably the most well-known of the tank rampages. He crushed more than 40 cars, as well as fire hydrants and utility poles. Witnesses said that the damage was clearly intentional. He was aiming for them. Over the course of 25 minutes, he knocked out power to some 5,000 homes. Up to this point, all of these rampages, no person had been killed, but in this case one was, and that was Sean Nelson. He got the tank stuck trying to cross over a median. The police got on top and managed to open the hatch using bolt cutters. He tried to throw them off by rotating the turret and not sure of his plans. The police fired once and killed Sean Nelson. And his motives were never clear, although his death at the hands of the police officer might have been his motive to begin with. So these incidences have often been reported as if they were somewhat comic, and I can understand that because there's clearly some absurdity here. And I think many tank enthusiasts, as we are here at Tankfest, can see the draw of using a tank to cut through traffic congestion. One would have been useful this morning when we were trying to get here, for sure. But of course, these represented significant risks to the public, and that's what the police would say throughout. They were simply trying to prevent them from harming people. In San Diego, the assistant police chief said, "I don't know how nobody else was killed." Most of them have resulted in changes in procedures to make it much more difficult to drive off with the tank, but apparently people still continue to do it all the way up into the 2000s. But that's another reason to love the Tank Museum, because it gives us this wonderful opportunity to enjoy our appreciation for these vehicles in a safe setting. Don't try this at home. They'll never invite me back. So I think I've run past my time here. I think we have someone speaking in a couple of minutes. Is that right? No, I lost everybody on the stage crew, but I'm the history guy. If you got any questions, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Happy to meet people, come around, and could talk to anybody who's a fan. This is the use of tanks in peacetime, something maybe a little different than you expected.